Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan F. Miles. I'm a former game designer and very seasoned TCG player. I've been playing card games for over 15 years. I've won a world championship. I've top 8 at the Banlist Spirits Pro Tour. I've topped Magic the Gathering, Grand Prix, Yu-Gi-Oh!, YCSs. I've been playing for a long time, and I think I know what I'm talking about when it comes to card games and especially game balance. So here are my thoughts on the Netherworld Depths ban. I just kind of want to pose a thought experiment to players in general and kind of walk you through my thoughts on the game. So this is a kind of a PowerPoint on game balance extremes and when to ban cards. So first up, I want to introduce this hypothetical power level graph where any card in any game can be placed on here. Either a zero is going to be a card that has functionally no text. It does not bring you in any way closer to winning a game. And in fact, it may just be a zero. Like a complete blank, like a card that does nothing. That would be a zero in this list. There aren't many zeros in card games because why would they exist, right? But cards can get pretty close. And then the other 10 on the spectrum, a 10 would be a card that absolutely literally just says win the game. And then every card kind of falls in the category or falls in the middle of that, right? Whether you're drawing cards, whether you're dealing damage, whether you're interacting with your opponent, cards are advancing you towards a win condition in some way or helping you win the game in some way. And every card can be classified on how well it gets you to winning the game between a 0 and a 10. So I'd like to introduce a hypothetical card here, Best Lance. Best Lance says, while the spirit attacks, win the game. When summoned, win the game. It costs 6 for reduction, sure. I think this card would be a 10, right? It just says win the game on it. The way that this card advances you towards winning is just by doing it outright. So that's what an example of a card that is a 10 would look like. We don't have any 10s in Battle Spirits. I don't even think we have any 9s. Nothing is really that close to outright winning the game, but that's what it would look like, right, in this hypothetical world. So this card would be too powerful, right? Like it's just unbalanced. The power level is too high. It completely invalidates all other gameplay. The only thing that matters when this card is in the game is that you play it and you win. And there's no efficient answers to it. There's no way to stop this from happening. There's no way to stop an on-summon effect. There's no way to look at your opponent's hand and take it out of there. It just completely invalidates everything. It would be the best card in the game. It's a 10, right? Nothing to talk there. This card should be banned. But let's take a hypothetical where we have Best Lance Counter. Best Lance Counter is a 2-mana card that says put all copies of Best Lance from your opponent's hand and deck into the trash. How does this change Best Lance? How does that change how you're supposed to play with Best Lance? It is clearly a counter to Best Lance. You play it, and then all of those copies are gone. If your opponent has multiple copies in their hand, then suddenly they're down a card or two. How does this change? Does this make Best Lance not a card that you want to play anymore just because a counter exists? This is kind of like the dies to removal argument, and the answer is no. Best Lance is still a 10. It still wins you the game on the spot. The consideration now is like, you still play for Best Lance because the upside of having it is so high that it is not invalidated by the downside of the counter. Does that make sense? Like, Best Lance is still something you're going to play for of. Everyone is also going to play for Best Lance counter because of how prevalent Best Lance has to be, but now you've sort of just made the gameplay less interesting. You have a counter, but you have not made the game better by doing so. And of course, this is a hypothetical. These cards don't exist because it's more interesting and more fun when games play in the realm of the 5s and 6s and 4s. You don't want to be on the end of the spectrum, but that's what that would look like, right? Let's have another hypothetical here. Here we have Drowsy Gameplay. 2-mana, main flash, put all Best Lance from your opponent's hand and deck into the trash. If there's at least one, you win the game. Well, now we have a very efficient answer to Best Lance, and not only that, the risk-reward balance is much higher. If you're playing Best Lance and I play Best Lance counter, I have just stopped you from winning, but you're still incentivized to play Best Lance because when that doesn't happen, you're still winning the game. There's no downside to putting Best Lance in your deck. Like, the counter to it is not as efficient as the upside of actually playing it. But now when you have Drowsy Gameplay says that there is an actual punish. The risk reward for Best Lance is now equal to playing it and not having it in your deck at all, right? So this creates balance. The power level of Best Lance is now answered by the efficiency of the answer, but it just makes the gameplay less efficient. If you look at a top 8 meta from a world where these two cards exist, you could see, 3 Best Lance decks, 4 Drowsy Gameplay decks, and then 1 aggro deck or something, right? And then people would say, wow, the meta is so diverse. Or if you, for example, have 2 different versions of Best Lance, you've got Best Lance and Best Nova, and Best Nova says win the game. Then you have Drowsy Gameplay and like another blue version of this card or whatever. Now you've got 4 different decks in top 8 and everyone's happy. Like, a diverse meta does not indicate that a meta game is healthy. It really just comes down to how the gameplay sort of plays out in those play patterns that makes a game interesting. So I don't think that anyone would agree that having a best lance and having drowsy gameplay is interesting, because it's really just a coin flip. You're playing rock, paper, scissors. You're taking something as complex as a trading card game and really boiling it down to more simplistic terms, when trading card games are interesting and unique because they have so many different parts that you can play that they become more complex and more engaging as a result. So I think that even though this is a counter to best lance, it does not make the game better or make best lance less of a problem, because the gameplay is less interesting by both of them existing. This is just an example of like a powerful card and interesting counterplay. Fanatec Elk, has this powerful effect where it can win the game without even having to attack your opponent. And, if you put this on the chart, it'd probably be like around a 5. It's a little expensive. The dies to removal argument is very prevalent here because there's efficient removal for it. Volcanic Break only costs 5, where Elk costs 7, or if with full reduction, it's 4 versus 3. There's interesting gameplay where in the face of a Volcanic Break, you can play Elk and then immediately court up to 5, so that you're out of range of Volcanic Break. Elk has interesting use cases. The counterplay against it is interesting. There's meaningful decisions that can be made at all stages of how cards like Elk and removal interact. But in the case of best lance and drowsy gameplay, there's nothing interesting about it. You're just playing a card that says win the game because it's the most efficient thing you can do for winning the game, and then your opponent plays drowsy gameplay because if you're playing best lance, it's the most efficient thing to beat you. It's just you have to play max copies of each, or maybe you take out best lance and now your opponent's copies of drowsy gameplay are dead. There's that's something that you could call interesting, but in reality becomes very old very quickly, and you're kind of deciding the game from deck building. Does your opponent have 4 drowsy gameplay and you don't have any copies of best lance, and now they're just throwing away cards and drawing duds? Do you have best lance? Your opponent doesn't play drowsy gameplay because they think you're not playing best lance. You can call this interesting, but if you played more than 5 games of this, I feel like it really would not be interesting game, and I think that most people would agree with that. So if we go back to the power level graph, where would you put Netherworld Depths? I think it's around an 8, right? If your deck has cards in it that want to win the game, then drawing cards is very good, right? And the fact that Netherworld Depths is going to draw you a card every time your opponent performs a game action, basically, if they want to stop themselves from dying or try to win the game, with the exact exception of the Elk, you're going to draw cards. And this is going to draw you at least one card. If you're at 1 life, right, and your opponent attacks you for your last life, this will draw you at least 1 card, and it will be immediately efficient. You play 1 card, you draw 1 card, but the ceiling of it is so much higher, where it's obviously not win the game, but when you start drawing 2, 3, 4, or 10 cards with Netherworld Depths, which is the ceiling of this card, unchecked, it can be very, very powerful. And it does not have any meaningful counterplay. The other cards that are similar to Netherworld Depths, Scorched Battlefield, you have to actually connect with your opponent. You need cores on it. Blessed Cathedral, you're going to draw cards when your stuff dies, but you need cores on it. And then Cathedral also ramps you stuff, but it has to be in combat. Sacred Stump Tree, your opponent has to actually hit you. You need cores on it. There's downsides to playing these cards where you need to have further investment once the card is on the field. And then there's meaningful interactions your opponent can take that can play around this. Scorched Battlefield, now, okay, I don't want my opponent to hit me. Blessed Cathedral, okay, I need to try and kill my opponent's guys outside of combat. Sometimes you can't do it, and that's what creates the interesting gameplay loops of Battle Spirits and keeps the game healthy. But Netherworld Depths doesn't really have that, because the core mechanic, just exhausting spirits, nets your opponent getting advantage. And that's a little problematic just because there's nothing you can do about it just by playing the game. Netherworld Depths puts your opponent ahead of you, and it needs to be answered immediately, or it really will run away with the game. And then when you look at the balance of it, okay, we do have answers. We have Nexus removal, and of course these are all red cards. And sure, it's fine to have certain matchups and counter other matchups. But even when you're looking at these, they all cost minimum three cores. Even with full reduction, King Vulture is going to cost 3 cores, Burning Force is going to cost 3 cores, Nebula Dragon is going to cost 3 cores. So you're only being as efficient as the problem. When we go back to Best Lance versus Best Lance counter, it really feels like, okay, my opponent is still incentivized to put Best Lance in the deck because Best Lance counter is not really a punish. If Best Lance goes unchecked, I win the game. If they have the Best Lance counter, I'm not that mad about it. And that's kind of what the problem we have here is that when Depths goes unchecked, it's very, very good at winning the game by itself. And then the answers for it are only as efficient as the problem. They're not drowsy gameplay. They're more Best Lance counter where they're answering the problem, but you're still incentivized to play 4 depths and then also play 4 Burning Force to answer other depths. And of course, this is an extreme example, and I am being a little bit hyperbolic here, but like this is what the top level of gameplay looks like when you're trying to build any deck that isn't aggro, pretty much. You're playing this depths minigame where the win percentage is so high for a depth that goes unchecked, but the best thing you can do to answer it is really just kill it as efficiently as they played it. And if you draw your efficient answers but they don't have depths, then you just have to hold your answer for the depths. And if they draw your depths and you don't draw the answer, like there's no gameplay that happens. You can't attack your opponent, you can't block without them drawing cards, and if they draw cards, they'll draw answers to your depths. If you find one, whoever gets it down first is massively advantaged. It's that kind of thing that really makes it not it just takes the interesting aspects of the gameplay out of it. You don't have the counterplay with these cards that you do with depths, and the best answer is really just not that efficient. So yeah, when you look at Burning Force, King Vulture, Nebula Dragon on the spectrum between Best Lands Counter and Drowsy gameplay, they're really closer to the left-hand side because they're just answering the problem for the cost that they paid to play it. 3 cores for 3 cores. King Vulture and Andromeda at least put a body on the board, so you're getting like a +1 card, but like if they played depths and immediately attacked and you had to take a block, then it's completely neutral. There's ways to engineer situations very easily, I feel like, that make it so depths is always at worst like card neutral, and then the ceiling is just so high that it can just really run away with games. So I do think we have some cards that are going in the right direction of answering depths in a meaningful way. Rocket City being one of them, where your opponent's going to draw, they have to discard immediately. It really stops depths from chugging away the game. And then Ice Goddess Frigg is a card we haven't seen pop up yet, but could soon, where if your opponent is, sticking multiple depths, you can just run them out of cores, tap them under Ice Shield, wipe their whole board because they have to pay cores off of their guys, and that can be a really big punish. But unfortunately, the problems with these cards right now, I think, is that they're just not as efficient as depths. Keeping 2 cores on Rocket City at all times to have a barely functional answer against your opponent drawing cards for free is just, it's again the right direction, but you're at a significant disadvantage to stop them from doing it. And then Ice Goddess Frigg on the same thing. It's a creature that dies to removal. How Frigg is very, very good at answering depths, but the cards that answer Frigg are very good at answering Frigg and are already in the depths deck. So she kind of loses out on the overall efficiency, even though in a vacuum, Frigg against depths is actually very favored for the Frigg player. So I think that I'm very in favor of a Netherworld Depths ban because it's just very powerful and it creates very uninteresting deck building and play patterns. And then it's not an inherently problematic card. It's just that the answers we have currently aren't efficient enough to deal with it. If we get more efficient Nexus removal in the future, if we get more cards like Frigg and Rocket City that can interact with it in a meaningful way, then it becomes less of a problem. But the game as it stands right now, I think would really benefit from a Netherworld Depths ban. And that's my logic for it. Thanks for watching.